Welcome. Always a pleasure to come and do a little bit of teaching with the St. Barnabas folks. You're always a really good to come to these forums, and you're one of the biggest. You're one of the biggest groups I get. So I'm always glad about that. Always great to be here. This year I've been thinking a lot about the people who are unchurched, and particularly this phenomenon that you may have heard about in the press about the so-called nuns. And when I'm talking about the nuns, let's see, I have a push there. I'm not talking about those ladies up there. I'm talking about the people who, when they're asked what their religious preference is, they say none of the above, okay? It's not like, oh, well, I grew up in the Episcopal Church, but I don't really go anymore, or whatever, any of that. It's more just like, I don't have any use for any form of organized religion, whether we're talking about Islam, Judaism, Christianity, anything, none of the above. And the reason that this group is particularly important is it's the fastest growing group in the United States. Okay? People who, when they're asked, what is your religious preference, they answer none. All right? They're mostly younger. Nuns tend to be mostly younger people, although not exclusively so. And what's particularly kind of interesting is that nuns usually have had some exposure in their life to a form of organized religion. They're not interested in it now, but way back there somewhere there's a little trace. Maybe they went to Sunday school or had some contact with a church or a mosque or the synagogue. Now I apologize for these tiny little letters here. What I want you to do is look at this graph here of the unaffiliated from 2007 to 2014. But first of all, see the ones in red? Those are the groups we're kind of familiar with. All in decline. Mainline Protestants, that's us, and we're in pretty steep decline. Roman Catholics in decline. Evangelical Protestants in decline. Right? And one of the things that's really important to remember when you talk about American religious life is that every single form of institutional or religious expression in the United States is in decline. There is one exception, and you're never going to guess it, so I'll tell you. The only religious group that is growing in the United States are the Amish. All right? We could probably have a whole discussion as to why the Amish are growing, but they're the only ones. Everybody else is in decline. Even those groups that will try to say to you, oh, we're just doing so fantastically well. The Southern Baptists had the steepest decline in the last 10 years of any religious group in the United States. Even the Mormons are in decline, although sometimes you wouldn't guess it by around here, but they also try to present themselves always as being more robust than they actually are. So just keep that in mind, and that will kind of continue to happen regardless of whether they're conservative, liberal, evangelical, high church, whatever. So it's always something to keep in mind that our challenge as organized religion is to help people understand that really their spiritual life needs to be lived out in community, which is something that Jesus was always talking about and the Bible's always talking about, but a lot of people don't really believe that and don't have much use for communities anymore in their lives. So we'll come back to that in a second. But look at this unaffiliated group. These are the nuns. They went from 16% in 2007 into 22% in 2014, and there are a lot of folks that think that it's actually closer to 30%. So roughly a third of our population comes under that category, and I'm sure that you know many of them, from your neighbors and so forth. They just say, I'm no use for that. I'm not interested at all. They're mostly younger. The 18 to 29-year-old group has the biggest percentage of nuns, but even people over 65 sometimes are nuns. They come in many different varieties. So if you talk to a nun and ask them about their spirituality, some will say, well, I'm an atheist. Some will say, I'm an agnostic. But most will say, this phrase that I bet you have all heard from somebody you know, and that is that I'm spiritual but not religious. Okay? There are also a group sociologists talk about, they call them the sums, and every church has some sums. They're not nuns, they're sums. They're people who, when pressed, will say, I don't really know what I believe, if anything, but, churches go okay. They're nice people there. They have good snacks at coffee hour. They do good work in the community, and, I don't mind going there, and, some of my friends are there and so forth, but I don't really know if I believe any of that stuff or not. Those are the sums. Now, the church, the organized church, has taken, I think, 3 different approaches to nuns. The first approach is the head in the sand approach, like, oh, well, we're just not even going to think about that we've got this growing part of our American population that's not interested in anything we're doing. Or sometimes churches will try to revise their teachings in a way that they believe might be more acceptable to this group. So Episcopalians are oftentimes criticized for this, and we've sometimes been called Unitarians investments. That we're not quite sure what our theology is, but we like to dress up and do ceremonial things and that sort of stuff. So we have to be really careful. I think we'll come back to this in a minute. That approach really doesn't work very well, and churches that try it find that it doesn't really work very well. It's an effort to sort of water down what we believe to sort of the lowest common denominator, so as to not to offend anybody or to be controversial about anything or whatever. And so, we get to the point in the end, you say, like, why bother? And, the third approach, just a drink of water, is the repackaging. I call that the lipstick on the pig approach. An example of that, I saw a few years ago in the paper that one of the big mega churches out in the West Valley was advertising for their Easter service, and they had on their ad, "Come to our church, we have Krispy Kreme donuts and Starbucks coffee." So that, that was going to be a thing that would attract people in. Well, again, I think those are kind of misplaced efforts. But there is I think, a more positive thing that we can do. Those of us who are in organized religions can take a more positive approach that has to do with finding common ground and points of discussion with the people that we know in our lives who are nuns. Nuns have their own spirituality. They tend, first of all, and you ask them and say, because a lot of them will say, I'm a very spiritual person. They say, okay, well, where do you find your spiritual fulfillment? And a lot of them will say, I find that in my relationships with my family, with food, and with my friends, and with my dog. And of course, we like those things too, don't we, most of us? So there's a little bit of common ground there. We're going to come back and talk about that in a minute. Nuns tend to be very cosmopolitan in their outlook. They don't like rigid systems. They like sort of whatever you're interested in, that's okay with them. It's a little bit like, whatever turns you on kind of thing. And so they're not very judgmental about other people's spiritual paths, because they said, well, if you find satisfaction doing that, that's okay. I accept that. So they don't like being told what they have to believe or systems that they have to follow. Probably don't like bishops. They like to network with other people who have similar beliefs that they do, rather than join organizations where you have to subscribe to, in order to be a member of this church, you have to believe the following 10 things. That's going to be a real turnoff to somebody who is a nun. And they're very socially compassionate. They want to make the world a better place. They want to be parts of groups where people practice what they preach, where they have integrity about what they believe. So again, I'm going to come back to these points in a minute. They want to see us as Christians, actually living as Christians. Remember I talked about the Amish? That's probably the reason the Amish are growing, because of this sort of total life-changing, all-encompassing commitment that you have to do if you're going to be Amish. I mean, you have to change everything in your life, right? And that's kind of attractive, actually, to nuns. That's not a turnoff. That's actually attractive. So let's take a little closer look at some of these things and talk about the fact that nuns, in their spirituality, tend to borrow from existing traditions. Some of these things that they like, which we also now have in the Episcopal Church, are things like meditation and incense and walking the labyrinth. We have you have a labyrinth here? Yeah, okay. Well, you know, down at the cathedral, which is downtown, so we've got a lot of foot traffic there. That labyrinth, almost any time or day or night, there's somebody out there walking that labyrinth. They're not going to church, but they're out walking the labyrinth. You know, it's very attractive. Icons, candles, pilgrimages, they like that kind of stuff. They're very interested in those things. And of course, Episcopalians, we have all this stuff, don't we? So we got a real market niche there. Here is a picture of a sort of a shrine or a little meditation area in a house of a nun. And notice what you see here. There's a statue of Buddha on the table, but above there's a crucifix. Okay? And then there's a Shinto calligraphy thing on the wall, probably a little New Age music going, candles. And then on the floor are some meditation mats. So here's a person who would say they're not interested in any form of organized religion, but in a sense, they've kind of put together somebody calls it smorgasbord approach to spirituality. Well, I like a little bit of this, and I like a little bit of this, and kind of interested in that, and kind of created their own sort of highly personalized religion. Now, a friend of mine, Elizabeth Drescher, who teaches at Santa Clara University, just came out with a book called Choosing Our Religion, The Spiritual Lives of America's Nuns. And I won't read you all this academic language that she has here, but she says that a more positive way forward for us as organized people of organized faiths in our dealings with nuns is to find some common ground where we're interested in the same thing that they're interested in. And instead of expecting them to come to church, we need to be going to them to have those kind of dialogue. And that she says where that's going to happen it's not going to happen in church buildings, it's going to happen in places like parks, pubs, bowling alleys, pizza parlors, laundromats, and food trucks. Now, that might seem kind of weird, but I'll give you an example of where that's actually worked. In the Diocese of Los Angeles, they have a movement that was started, or a project rather, started by one of their deacons called Laundry Love. And Laundry Love got started like this. One of the local congregations contracted with the laundromat that they were going to take over the laundromat on Monday night. The church bought the use of the laundromat. And they invited everybody in the community that wanted to do their laundry to come and do their laundry for free. Okay? And they were in kind of a, sort of gritty area of town. So they had a lot of people who needed they didn't have any place to wash their clothes. So they did this. And they started this program, and people from the congregation came down and to hang out with the people that would come in to do their laundries, and sometimes they'd bring snacks and that sort of stuff. Well, after about a month or so, one of the people that was coming in with their laundry said, "You guys are all from a church, right?" And they said, "Yeah." And they said, "Could we have some prayers before we go tonight?" And the people from the church said, "Yeah, that'd be great." So they started as part of their Monday night time when it was time to close up. They'd have prayers together. Well, about a couple months later, somebody else who was coming said, Does your church do that bread and wine thing? Could we have some bread and wine and do that? And so they said, yeah. So they had one of the clergy from the church that was there. So now every Monday night, they have church at the laundromat. Okay? Now these are people who would have never been reached, would have never darkened the door of a church, but now are, in a sense, forming a worshiping community, a community of faith, based out of the fact that the church came to them to find common ground with them. So, it used to be when I was growing up, people would talk about, I called it the build it and they would come model. You know, like if our church only had the following things, and all we would have to do is open the doors and people would just come streaming in because, you know, we would have the best music in town or the best preaching or the biggest gym or whatever it was, and then people would just come flocking in. Well, that doesn't work anymore, if it ever did. Now, if the church is going to grow, we that are in the church need to be present in those other places where we can have these interactions with unchurched people. I mean, I think it really kind of comes down to that. So she says one of the places to do this is to look for the common ground in these 4 F's that she mentions, the friends, family, food, and Fido. So let's talk about each one of those. The Episcopal Church does much better now in terms of being a friendly place. Some of you have been Episcopalians for a long time, probably have horror stories about how either in your church or when you visited a church that people were completely unfriendly to you. You don't tell me them all now, but I'm sure that you, I mean, I have some of those too that I could tell. So we're doing much better. We probably need to go deeper beyond the sort of coffee hour friendliness to really being able to share more of the deeper part of ourselves. But that'll take some time, and that usually happens in church in small groups and stuff. So we're doing a lot better. But one of the ways that we can interact with the unchurched is to have events that are, in a sense, not too churchy. You know, invite people to things like a concert. You've got one this afternoon, okay? Sporting events. We have baseball night, Episcopal baseball night in the fall. So your neighbor who would be totally freaked out if you said, "Why don't you come to our church? Why don't you come? We're going. A bunch of us going to the baseball game tonight. You want to come?" Oh, okay, sure. You know, and beginning to build those relationships where you have that common ground. So those are things you might think about. Family. You guys do a really good job of this. You have the resources to do it, but being a kid-friendly place is really important to attract nuns. Remember, most of them are millennials. Most of them are younger. Most of them have kids. So they're looking for places that their kids are going to feel at home. The thing I hear most about as a bishop is people, they'll say, "Well, somebody came to visit our church, but we didn't really have anything for kids, so they went someplace else." This is a very common refrain that I hear a lot. We want to have programs that don't put parents in what I call Sophie's choice, which is either come to the church program or spend time with your kids. Don't put parents in that bind, because they really need to pick their kids. And then you're going to say, "Well, why did nobody come to this program?" Well, because they'd have to leave their kids if they did. So if you're going to have those programs, make sure there's an opportunity for kids to participate or be involved in some way so they don't have to leave them at home. And of course, high standards of programs, especially for young children. I don't need to tell you about that. You do a good job of that, and that's vital for any kind of church growth. Food, I mentioned this is something that millennials especially, I've got 2 millennial kids, and my son, until he was 16 years old, I don't think ate anything but pizza and grilled cheese sandwiches. And then he met a woman. They're getting married this summer. He's now 29, but they become total foodies. And they live in New York, and they spend all this time like going to Korean grocery stores and buying weird ingredients and going to little hole-in-the-wall restaurants. He said, "Dad, we had reindeer heart pate." Now, if any of you have any association with millennials, does this sound familiar? Do you notice this foodieism that is growing among younger people? You know, when I was that age, I was like meat and potatoes. We didn't care about stuff like that, you know. And now, you know, everything has to be this exotic food thing. So having said that, I think if I could do life over again as a parish priest, one of the things I would do is I would have a meal every Sunday at church. And I would make it a really good meal where people could get involved. Not just the sort of, you know, standard potluck fare, but have people who are really good cooks say, "Oh, you better come Sunday because Alice is making her famous beef Wellington," you know, or something like that, and say, "Oh, I'm not going to miss that." You know, the food thing has become very important to people now. And another thing churches can do, it's real easy, is farmers markets, because all those millennials love to go to farmers markets. They like to buy organic, buy local, all that kind of stuff. And the churches really have a great opportunity because you have this big parking lot, you see. So you can have a fair on Saturday morning, and all the kids come and the dogs come and all that kind of stuff, and people walk around, and you rent your space to the local merchants, have them come set up their booths and sell their organic produce or whatever it is, and you get a little money from it. But more importantly, you get this interaction with the community, which is really important. So it's something you might think about, is doing a farmer's market. Now, this is not just an excuse to show you a picture of my dog Chappie, who is looking forlorn because I'm not there. But dogs are really important. Somebody said, "Are you going to talk about cats?" And I said, Nah, I'm not talking about cats. But dogs are really important. And do you have a pet blessing? That's a great way to start. Communities love pet blessings. You'll see people at pet blessings you never see any other time, right? And that's a way of making those inroads with the community. St. Francis Day celebration, pet cemeteries. We have a number of our congregations that have pet crematoria, pet grief support groups. It's very, very hard for people when they lose a pet, particularly a dog. You can tell which side I'm on this debate. Pet-friendly services. Now, only do this with a consultation with your rector and vestry. But I actually think it's a good idea to allow people to bring their dogs to church. And I'll give you an example why. Out at Sun City, the rector out there told me about, he had visited this couple that he hadn't seen in church for a while. They used to be very regular, and he hadn't seen them for many weeks. So he went to see him at home. And they said, "We can't come to church anymore." And he said, "Well, why not?" And they said, "Well, a couple months ago, our house got broken into, and the thief beat our dog. And so we're afraid to leave our dog at home alone anymore for any length of time." Now, it's not a rational fear, but that's where they were. And he said, "Well, just bring them." They said, "We can do that?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So now they bring their dog, and they're there every Sunday. Now, you have to be careful because, there's some people that are afraid of dogs, and some people are allergic to dogs and that kind of thing. And, of course, some dogs are not well behaved enough to be in church for the whole time. But if doing this, thinking this through a little bit, I actually think it's a good idea. And if you can't do that, we've got one church in Tucson that has a service dog that comes to coffee hour. So everybody sees the same service dog every week, and, they bring her treats and pet her and stuff. So those are some common grounds. Now, I mentioned before, another common ground is that nuns are very interested in bettering the community. They don't think that the church, their perception of the church is that the church does nothing except look out for itself. My chaplain friend at NAU said the thing he hears the most from the college students is, love Jesus, hate the church. Why? Because they perceive the church as only a bunch of self-centered hypocrites. They only care about money. They only care about themselves. That they're not doing anything for the community. And in fact, I could take that a little further. I think sometimes I've found that people in the church don't know what other people in the church are doing in the community. So you might have a group, say, who's really involved. Let's just take an example, who's doing Habitat for Humanity. Let's say an example. And that if you were to take a survey of the people in the pew on Sunday morning, most people wouldn't even know that there was a group doing Habitat for Humanity. So you guys need to let your light so shine that people may glorify your Father in heaven. And the one way you can do this, I tell churches this all the time, is T-shirts. I'm a great believer in T-shirts. Wherever you are in the community doing something, put your T-shirt on that says, St. Barnabas cares about your community, or St. Barnabas cares about our youth, or whatever, so that people get that message, so that they don't think, well, St. Barnabas only cares about themselves. They're not interested in the rest of us. So I could give you lots of examples of this, but people don't expect to. They're very interested in Jesus. Nuns are very interested in Jesus because of Jesus's compassionate love for humanity, but they don't see that coming from the churches. There's no evidence for that for them. And in fact, what they usually see about the church is what they pick up in the media, which is all negative. You know, it's the sexual scandals, it's the financial scandals, and it just backs them up. See, they're just a bunch of hypocrites. They don't care about anybody but themselves. Why would I want to be a part of a group like that? So let them know what you're doing. I think we have an opportunity here then, those of us who are in institutional religion or organized religion, whatever you want to call it. But in order to do that, we need to be very clear about our core values and our beliefs. Why do we do what we do? Let me give you a little example. Do you have an AA group that meets here?
Yes.
Okay. A lot of churches do. And here's an example. I've discovered that people who come to AA groups, and I've been to a few to observe, that come to AA groups do not know why the church is hosting them. Okay? They think that the church is hosting them because they're getting rent. Okay? Now, in actuality, most churches either don't charge rent or it's a very nominal amount to sort of offset the electrical cost or something like that. But the perception of those folks sitting in AA is the reason that we're meeting here is the church gets the rent. So I say to the churches, one of the things you can do is like have a little sign out on the table that says, we know this is really hard, what you're doing. And we at St. Barnabas, we're praying for you. Really? Yeah. Or, you know, some literature about the church, not so much in terms of why don't you come here, but just that we care about you. Or have some members of your vestry or other folks from the church just come and visit an AA meeting. Just just say we're glad you're here because we want to support you in what we know is a really terrible struggle that you're going through, and we're here with you prayerfully in that. That makes all the difference. See, so people know why it is you're doing something. What are your core values? They're experiencing your core values, but see, people oftentimes don't know that. Engage fully with the community. I could talk a lot about this. You're doing pretty well on that, I think. Practicing radical hospitality. I've been reading some of the folks getting confirmed today, and I always ask the people getting confirmed to write me a little letter about why they're getting confirmed, and they kind of give me their spiritual autobiography. And about 4 or 5 times this little slogan has come up in their letters that they came to St. Barnabas and they heard Jim say at announcement time, if you think you belong here, you do. I've seen that in like 4 letters, so that's very effective marketing, but it's also true. And that's the radical hospitality. That's saying we don't care where you are, who you are absolutely fully welcome here. Now, this is a change in paradigm for churches. A friend of mine is a Lutheran theologian, said that when he was growing up, there was a certain order about how one became a Lutheran. The first thing you had to do was you had to go to class and learn the catechism. And you had to memorize it. And once you did that, then they said, okay, now you're going to learn how Lutherans behave in church. And after you did that, well, okay, now you know the catechism, now you know how we do things, now you know our behavior, okay, now we're going to let you belong. So the three B's: belief, behavior, belonging. And he says, and I think he's right, that we need to turn that on its head. And what really needs to happen is the first step is belonging. If you think you belong here, you do. That's the starting point, rather than, well, you have to know all these kind of things and you have to understand how we do things liturgically and that kind of stuff. But sort of say, all right, you come, you belong, and then by observation you say, oh, that's how Episcopalians behave. That's how they worship together. That's how they're involved in the community. That's how they treat one another. I wonder why they do that. Oh, we'll be glad to tell you. Now we're going to talk about belief. You see, so it moves in a different direction. It moves from belonging to behavior to belief. And I think that that's a very important observation. And let me just give you an example. Some of you may remember Matt Marino, who used to be our youth person. He's now working in Texas. He grew up in a totally hostile religious household. His father hated religion. So he had no real exposure to it at all. And when he was in high school, he was on the basketball team. And there were these 5 guys on the basketball team that he noticed behaved differently than the rest of the people on the basketball team. They were nice to the girls. They're polite. They didn't swear, didn't use foul language all the time. They treated each other with a sort of great sportsmanship. And he just said they were different than the rest of the team. So he went over to him one time and he said, "Why do you guys behave the way you do?" And they said, "Well, we're Christians." And he said, "I want some of that. I want to be like that. How do I do this? What do I do? How do I learn more?" Well, they said, "Just come be with us and find out." But it wasn't, "Okay, you better believe these things," or whatever. It was their attractiveness of offering something different was very compelling to him. And of course, he became a Christian, and later on he became a priest. So be clear about our core values and beliefs, engage fully with the community, and practice radical hospitality. And I think if we do, we will find that we're making some inroads into this growing group of folks that up to now have rejected us and can sort of say, well, maybe there's something there. Yeah, I want some of that. I want some of that because I've seen that at work in you folks. I want that. So I hope that's maybe helpful in a slightly different approach to dealing with the unchurched than maybe you sometimes hear about. So we got like 5 minutes if anybody wants to pick up on any questions. Yeah.
Bishop, I have a question on a different topic. Is
Okay,
that all right?
sure. Yeah, sure.
This morning's Republic has an op-ed piece about this Johnson Amendment
Yeah.
that there we go, that forbids churches from endorsing political candidates.
Right.
How do you feel about that?
I haven't really studied all that much. I probably know about as much as anybody else does about it. Somebody pointed out that that's actually been going on for a long time, that has basically been ignored for a long time. And it's certainly true. I always used to get kind of irritated because, for instance, one time we had an Episcopal priest in Pasadena, George Regas, who said something critical, not about any particular candidate, but about a particular policy, and the IRS came down hard on him. But then in the southern states, you have these big Baptist churches where every Sunday they're told who they're supposed to vote for, and nobody ever investigates them. So it's been, in a sense, it's kind of been going on forever. My first thought is probably not really a good idea. Not because religion shouldn't have anything to do with politics. It should. I mean, if you read the Bible, the whole thing's political. But I'm not sure that it's really productive in the long run for what the church should really be about. I don't think it really helps us to be partisan. I think it helps us to be very clear about what our core values are and to say, for instance, we need to treat the poor right. This great thing I saw, this great slogan, it said, "Nobody gets into heaven without a reference letter from the poor." That's part of what it means to be a Christian, is to care for those who are in need, to care for the environment, to protect the environment. We're supposed to be stewards of the environment. I mean, these are sort of core Christian values, to respect the dignity of every human being. We say that when we get confirmed or when we renew our baptismal promises, right? So those are core values that we need to be very clear about, but that's different instead of saying, vote for Bob for mayor. You know what I mean? And quite frankly, from the earliest time of the church, in my book, somebody like St. Augustine is always reminding us, we're never going to find salvation through politics. Never. Never. It doesn't matter who you're talking about. We might make things a little better or worse. There's no doubt about that. But we're not going to solve the problems of the human race by electing the right person to be president. We're not. It's about our change of heart, and when our hearts change, then we can be transforming agents in the world. But not before that happens. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment earlier. I just wanted to comment about how you mentioned towards the very end of your lecture about this guy who grew up in a hostile religious family and
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in a very deeply religious family.
Uh-huh.
Our family started out Roman Catholic, but ended up being Episcopalian.
Uh-huh.
But but the way I grew up, I used to disagree with everything my family said, and it also included religion. I used to be hostile towards religion, but not anymore.
Uh-huh.
My family steered me straight. So if you ever see my family, thank them for steering me towards the religious part.
Right. Right. That's good. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was just talking about those who didn't have that. That didn't have that influence in their lives, and this nun group, they don't have people around them that are oftentimes faithful folks.
You were mentioning the hostile environment that a lot of people have experienced, and I want to thank you for your post on your epistle this week. There are groups that have, at least for the last several decades, received a lot of bad press and a lot of hostility and anger.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems like a fertile ground for trying to reach out and reclaim those people, if you want to say, because
Mm-hmm.
I being one of them,
Mhm.
but 10 years ago I came here and found out y'all didn't hate me. And it was a shock. I
Uh-huh.
didn't expect it at all.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm here.
Right.
And so the more that we can reach out
Yeah.
to those folks,
Right.
and not just
Sure.
gay people such as myself, there's other people that
Right.
suffer it. The more we can reach out to those folks and say,
Yeah.
this church is
That's
for
right.
you and is with
Right.
you and loves you.
So that's why I'm saying let your light so shine, so that people know that. And we're oftentimes not very good on letting the outside world know what we represent, what we're about, what we do, how we're engaged with the community.
Because we're a small voice
That-
against a very loud
Yeah,
public voice
yeah,
that
we are.
says the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask, and maybe it's some risk, but I wanted to ask, when you were talking about an altar in the person,
Mhm.
in a nun's home,
Yeah.
I was surprised. I'm blessed with a daughter who grew up here,
Uh-huh.
who would consider herself a nun,
Uh-huh.
would name herself as a nun, but who within the last couple of years talked about the altar in her home.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very surprised, and I didn't know whether or not. So I commend you on your presentation, and I didn't know whether people would be interested in raising your hand if you know a nun. I do.
I think we probably all know
See,
at least one.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And some in our families, to be sure. Yeah. Okay, I think we're probably out of time, right, Elizabeth? Just about? Okay. So, good to see some of you in church already. See the rest of you over there in a few minutes.